Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this event. It marks the Day of the Africa Child and is hosted by the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa at LSE. Well, it was in 1991 that the OAU set up the DAC in memory of a student uprising in South Africa that began on the morning of the 16th of June, 1976. Around 20,000 school children bravely took on one aspect of the inequalities and inhumanity of the apartheid state, demanding basic education in their own languages. For those demands, they were met with fist, with baton, and with bullet. Hundreds lost their lives, but it inspired a new generation of resistance and shamed an international community that until then was just standing by. So today we honor their memory, and this event helps us remember that sacrifice. Because today we are contributing to this year's Day of the African Child by asking what might seem a simple question, but is actually quite complicated. How can we better and faster implement the Africa Committee Agenda 2040 that of fostering an Africa fit for children? And we're honing in particularly on Article 10 of that agenda, which states that the views of Africa's children matter. And in turn, that relates to aspiration 6 of the AU agenda for 2063, which positions children as the drivers of Africa's renaissance. The challenges are huge. You don't need the likes of me to tell you that. Children are still massively marginalized or silenced, patronized, excluded, and are not participating enough in policymaking. Epistemic injustice is far worse for young people in Africa because of lives too often lived in poverty and vulnerability, and lives too often at the whim of external actors and stakeholders. So how do we engage children more? How do we unlock their participation in achieving better outcomes, fairer outcomes, basic outcomes in health, welfare, and education? How can their voices be heard better? Well, when I was given the honor of chairing this, I couldn't help but going back to my time with an African professor in Cambridge, when he used to tell his students, he used to advise them how best to listen to written sources. He said you need to treat them like small children. Remember, they speak quietly, so you need to listen carefully, and you need to lean in. You need to lean down to them. But childhood as sources, how do we access those kinds of feelings and inner worlds? It's incredibly challenging for our scholar activists. And I think it's fascinating to think about the fact that it's only from the age of 3 that memory starts to be verbalized. It's also significant, I think, that we have so few written memoirs from children. They remain very elusive. Adults recall childhood filtered through hindsight, through nostalgia or repression. We all know that teenagers like to look forward, not backwards. And we adults often dismiss how much children can see, how much they know. So I'm relieved today then that we have an amazing collection of leaders in the field here who are experts in the theme of today's discussion, perspectives from scholar activists on epistemic justice for children and young people in Africa. Each one of them is well known for their pioneering research, and we have been gathered together by the person that anchors us as LSE in this subject, Dr. Eliza Nugiduku, a research fellow here in the Firoz Lalji Center. But we're also very blessed and lucky to have Professor Hasina Ibrahim, professor at the University of South Africa in the Department of Early Childhood, Dr. Odur Obura, lecturer in at Zitech University, Nairobi. And last but by no means least, Dr. Yisak Teferi, lead quantitative researcher at Young Lives Research, Ethiopia. So our plan then is to hear from Dr. Eliza Nugiduku first, then we'll hear from each of our other distinguished panelists who will then be in short dialogue with each other before we take your questions. So thank you again for joining us today. And I'd now like to get started by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Eliza Nugiduku. Her doctoral research at Erasmus University in Rotterdam focused on children's complex lived experience of poverty and vulnerability in Kenya. Those of you that will have read her writings know the harrowing work and the amazing evidence that she gathered. She's carrying out still path-breaking research and pioneering new methodologies in accessing the voice of the child in policy and programming, and exploring further how to decolonize childcare policy and practice in Africa. Dr. Nugiduku, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Just 1 second again. I thank you very much that we are all gathered here again to talk about children's voice. And I'm not going to go back to the good things that Joanna has talked about in terms of also introducing what we are talking about, the Day of the African Child today. The only thing I will add is that I was saying that if we were in Africa now, we would have been busy, spent the day out there and also singing. And one thing that we liked most is that when children go out, then we will be able to get some pocket money and your mother will not ask you, you know, what did you spend the money on? And most of the time, you know, children will buy something like some bread. So if you can be able to grab some bread or some soda or some drink, please grab and be in solidarity with the hundreds and thousands of children in Africa who are very happy today because of what has been achieved so far. And so in relation to what Joanna has said, I'm going to be talking about listening to young people, also drawing from my research, but also drawing from my many years of activism also, and also interacting with some of the panelists that are also here, but also concerning myself only with the issues of listening to children. When we talk about accelerating the Agenda 2040, we cannot do that when we've not heard the voice of children, but not only heard them, but also given their views and the perspectives, the weight they so deserve. So this particular agenda again draws, of course, on the African Charter on the rights of a child in Article number 4, but also the Mother Child Law itself, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child, which also gives the right, children the right to for their views to be heard in everything that does concern them. And we are going to be engaging around that. But despite the fact that, as Joanna has also shared and I've also talked about, you know, there are these many provisions that children should be heard. We are gathered here because we want to engage on issues of epistemic injustice for children. Despite this, the views of children in Africa do continue to be marginalized. And sometimes when they are heard, then these views are not given the weight they do deserve. And it is on that basis, then, we are saying that children themselves in Africa are wronged as knowers. And this sense of being wronged as a knower is what, drawing from Miranda Africa, who's a philosopher on voice, but she's also a legal, she does her work around the legal issues. She says that on that basis, then, that is what we call epistemic injustice. And she does identify two ways in which this does happen. And she talks about testimonial injustice, And this occurs where, the voice or the views of a person are given lower credibility because of the prejudices we have about the person. And it might be because of gender, maybe because of class, maybe because of religion and other such markers of difference. But then she also talks about hermeneutical injustice. And then she says, does happen where in a particular society, there are no collective resources, interpretive resources to enable you even to understand the experience of a person. So in that case, even when you wrong that particular person, there's nothing in your repertoires to enable you to be able to name it as a wrong. And so this is my starting point. And of course, starting point of other scholars in childhood who've also talked about, this happens to everybody as epistemic injustice, but then it is more serious for young people also, and for children and young people, because of their positioning in generational relations, which are also relations of power, because young people and children are also dependent on adults. So any form of injustice in terms of their knowledge then would affect them more, because at the end of the day, when we wrong them also, but they also have to rely on us for their thriving and for their well-being. And Karen Maurice, who does her research in South Africa, says, sometimes you may hear, but what we do is that we do put some metaphorical sticks into our ears in terms of these prejudices. And of course, she goes on and talks about it is more serious for children who are Black, but then also issues of children also who are living in poverty. So this is our starting point in terms of saying that children, in that sense, they are wronged as knowers. And of course, even as you talk about the Day of the African Child, we must really get back to ourselves and think through how is the voice of children also subsumed in different ways under that of adults. And in these relations of power, which also imply also relations in terms of who has the resources, then of course African countries would be more marginalized, because also then we are also relying on others who are located elsewhere. And when I say elsewhere, it's of course most of the donors who are coming from the north. And in such cases, then sometimes, and not to say that there's collusion to marginalize or to muzzle the voice of children of Africa, then the stories that sometimes are told, are not eventually the ones that are sold. And based on our particular reflexivities also and the research that we've done, and we did a one-year research which was action-oriented in Kenya and Uganda, there are also these persistence of specific misrepresentations of children of Africa also, and with perspective that, views that children in Africa are supposed to be seen but not heard. But our research that we did disproved this. But it is not just some prejudice or just a representation, because then it has impact, which is also very practical, because what we do is that we expend resources trying to give voice to children of Africa and also to caregivers, yet instead of working with what is there and enhancing the voice that is already there. But that one also has another implication also for our ways of knowing as African scholars also. So it does not only erase the voice of children, it also does erase the voice of caregivers. I remember doing research with caregivers and telling us we thought we did not know anything about early childhood development, but we've been doing ECD, since we gave birth. But then it also does erase the voice of African scholars also, because of these different power configurations also in terms of also knowledge production, what is accepted as ultimate knowledge in terms of growth and development of children and that kind of a thing. And the research I did also in my ethnography, I looked also at different policies, so just implications on also the policies and the voice of children that is involved, included in the policy. And I had conversations with people who are key in developing specific policies and listening to them and hearing how in very specific ways the voice of children was marginalized because of assumptions, perhaps maybe because we have already listened to people who are working with the children, or maybe another reason was that because this policy, children said we wanted it, so because they said we wanted it, then that's how we developed it without them. And then such policies, of course, are also contrary to the lived experience. So epistemic injustice then leads to very practical marginalization of children. But other thing we've also observed in our activism also around voice in Africa, even the few of us who purport to give the children of Africa voice also, we also tend to work with the older children. And sometimes the very young children, the ones that are in the East, with the kindergartens, the ones that are in the ECD centers, they are left out. And most of what we do is we do survival work, like, are they immunized, are they, growing and thriving well and all that. And so this is part of the work that I've done around with my colleagues, of course, and I think I met also Professor Azina in KwaZulu-Natal sometimes in 2008, where we had gone with this big delegation of scholars from many actors from East Africa and exchanging views on how we can liberalize our knowledge, how we can be able to bring back our knowledge on childcare, how we can be able to bring out these stories from the margins that sometimes are discredited. And when they are discredited, then we are not able also to listen to our children, and we are also not able to listen to our caregivers. So we've done a lot of work around giving voice to young people. But what has happened in the last few years in my own reflexivity around voice, and this happens, of course, with the scholars and researchers also, I became a little bit uncomfortable with the voice that we also sometimes tend to give to children, and discover that these particular issues that I've talked about, the prejudices are not just also ideological, because it's not enough just to linger there and dance around the fact that, our voice, we are not being given our voice. I also discovered that we are also, as researchers also from Africa, we are also implicated in different ways. So asking myself, whose voice is it that we're talking about? And coming to the realization that this voice itself is not a given. And looking, of course, at what was happening in 1990s, for those of you who can remember, the whole movement of the new social studies of childhood, which is also called the new sociology of childhood studies, with the issues around voice and children being acknowledged as speaking subjects, but also children being seen as agents. But then looking at that voice of the childhood studies being the voice that we give to children, being only the voice that children speak, the voice that is given to us. And some people have said it's a metaphysical voice because you can hear it, you can almost feel it, and you've given it to children. And then, of course, moving from that and thinking that we cannot do enough justice to voice of children by only looking at making this voice to be plural, or maybe looking at different perspectives. And where this brought me was this space, which was also methodological and also conceptual. I do a lot of research around concepts also. And then the honors then, according to this particular reflexivity, was that we don't stop talking about giving voice to children, but how can we problematize this voice? And I like using the word problematize in a very caring way when I'm talking about children, because I know it is a very important aspect of voice, even the spoken one, because I've also done research with the deaf youth sometimes who don't even have that first step of being said that they can possess voice. So I decided to look at how voice itself happens, and then voice as a multiplicity. And these are the said and the unsaid, the silenced, and also issues of silencing. So how can we be more reflexive on how voice does happen, so that we can be a little bit comfortable with the voice that we talk about, that we can say to ourselves that we've done enough in terms of listening to children. And I'm just going to give examples here that voice itself can be silenced. For those of you who remember Article number 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child, talks about the right for children to express themselves. It is a right, it is not a duty. So a child can also keep quiet as part of expressing their right. So silence can also be agency. Silence can also be that particular freedom. But then I also discovered that we've lingered at this point of children keep quiet for too long as researchers, also myself included. And we fail also to research the silence itself, because sometimes silence itself may be because of processes that silence children or other processes that make children not to talk. And of course, when you're also located within relationships of power, then researchers, most of them are adults. So the adult gaze also, sometimes it is also the expert gaze also that may make children not to speak. So you research around it, but you also use other methods that can also enable you to get that particular voice of children. So this is what I'm calling listening softly. And you must try to pronounce it that way, softly. When somebody tells you to listen softly, it is already an orientation towards voice, and you start imagining that I need to do things differently. I need to imagine this voice beyond what I've been saying. And then in my research, I also discovered that children can also be silenced by issues of culture, in the sense that when we also go back to Frika's notion that some of the issues, taboos that I came across in my research that have affects children and their well-being, the children themselves could not even talk about it because it was not within the realm of what they've even imagined that they could question. The older generations also, maybe even those ones who are in their 40s, they didn't know about it. It was only a few older generations that were able to tell me the reason why this particular practice does continue. So sometimes in that case, then voice becomes what children themselves are not able to. It is unsayable because it is not within what we can imagine. And then we also know, and this is for everybody also, that voice can also be mediated in the sense that it is entangled with the voice maybe of the parents or the voice of the teachers also, sometimes the voice of those ones who are in programs of support. And so the voice that sometimes you say you've been given sometimes may be what other adults in children's ecology want them to say. And because the child is also embedded in those social relations. And so some of them can enhance voice, but some of them can also limit that particular voice. So then voice in that sense becomes what children cannot say because of what is allowed to say at that particular moment. And talking to young children also, and I think Professor Zina works a lot with young children also, issues of also how voice happens in the sense of whole body listening. How are you listening to a child? How are children expressing themselves? What does a child who responds to a question that you did not ask mean? What does a child that responds past a question mean? What does the pauses mean? What does the sigh? What does the whole body language mean? It is all imbued with specific meanings. And unless, of course, you apprehend it, that you are only going to have one-sided perspective of what voice means. And listening softly is this continuous reflexivity on our ways of knowing. As a researcher, I'm always located. Even if I'm not a researcher, I'm consulting on a program, I'm always located in a particular way. So what are my assumptions? Is it my imperial gaze? Is it my expert gaze? Is it my class gaze that is also guiding me? Sometimes it's also ethnic gaze that also does affect the way you're able to capture voice of children. And now listening softly, of course, is the opposite sometimes of the quick consultations that we make when we are listening to children. And I'm not saying that everybody should become an ethnographer that like I've done, or sometimes, do like 3-year research for 3 years that we've done. But then it might just mean that you just revisit what you know and ask yourself, how do you know it? And how can you be able to know it in a different way? And as I finish, then listening softly then implies that you use the appropriate methods to be able to capture this particular voice. And I usually say that we are so devoted to interview methods, and we think sometimes the interview methods can also be able to capture everybody's voice. So for me, I used different methods. For example, I used diaries, I used essays, I used photo narratives, and these particular methods enabled me to get perspectives of children, and especially this young girl was 1.5 years old, and I was able to get her own perspectives. This particular boy telling me that these are the only clothes that we have. It was easier for him to talk to me about it that way than me sitting with him and starting to ask him, why are you poor? And so these particular methods, they go further than enabling you just to triangulate voice. But for me, they enabled me to be able to research around these different aspects. For example, I was able to research around silence. I was able to know why were children silent. I was able to give them another opportunity to talk to me about things that they felt were difficult for them to talk to. But then also this voice that emerged in our discussions, I was able to follow it on my research on lived experience of children with poverty in Siaya. And I think this is a good point to stop so that we continue with the conversations.
Asante sana, Eliza. Thank you so much for that incredibly rich and stimulating presentation. I'm sure, like everybody else, my head is buzzing from all the things that you've said. Thank you so much. But it's my great honor next to introduce somebody who needs no introduction, I'm sure, Professor Hasina Ibrahim from the University of South Africa, where she also holds the UNESCO Tri-Chair in Early Education, Care and Development. I can't, in the time that we've got, do justice to all her accomplishments. Suffice to say that she is convener of the Knowledge Working Group of the AU's Early Childhood Cluster, and is currently working on initiatives to increase early year capacity building and material development. Professor Ibrahim, thank you so much for sparing the time to join us. I'm not sure how you had the time to join us, but thank you, and it's over to you next.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for the introduction, and it is certainly my pleasure to be here this afternoon and to support someone that I've seen grow, emerge, and actually shaping new contours for the region and beyond. None less than Dr. Nugiduku. I'm very, very proud of you. I've seen you grow and I've seen the milestones in your career, and way to go, girl. What I'd like to comment on is, at the outset, is the kinds of contributions that are made when you think and you think differently. So one of the things that really fascinated me about this presentation is the way in which the local knowledge, the local context has been privileged as a place where there's humble starting points to make knowledge, to know the social actors, to know who is influential, to know who is not influential, and so forth. So for me, what was very, very refreshing is this quest to bring epistemic justice in an environment where you have a broader context of imperialism and uncritical borrowing. So we're very used in Africa to take on the slants that says, this is best practice. This is how you do things. And if you do this, you're going to get it right. So we take this kind of universalized, standardized approach, and we think that it's the magic bullet for the kinds of interventions that we want. And implicated in this is the lives and the voices and everything else that has to do with children. And this is what Dr. Nugiduku has made us aware of and provided deeper insight in. And I think that the field that I work in is early childhood care and education, and largely from birth to 5 years. And the perspective of children as social actors, as people with voices, as experts in childhood. So babies babbling, that's their expertise. And to look at them in any other way would give you a reading that compromises the capacity to act. So the work that I've been doing, coupling with the agency view that Dr. Nugiduku is promoting, that is so important, what it does, it allows you as an adult working with children from different kinds of facets to position yourself as a learner. And when you position yourself as a learner, you make kinds of connections that you didn't do previously. So if children, and I'm talking about very young children, are respected as people that have the capacity to act, then it means that adults have to rethink the concept of generationing and how it structures adult-child relations in society. And if you look at early childhood and the assets that it brings for us to unpack, either as the workforce or as researchers or as academics or as parents, there are so many things that needs to be unpacked. And one of this is around the agentic child. What is this child trying to tell me? Is the adult willing to see the meaning that the children are making? So these are the kinds of things that have concerned me quite substantively. And so in the studies that I've done, I'm a qualitative researcher because I believe that we have to know the narratives that are behind the number crunching. So if we go deep into the narratives, and ethnography and the ethnographic approach is very, very suitable. And to work with situated realities is also a very, very important way of connecting. If we're able to do that methodologically, and I've written about this, working with situated ethics instead of this top-down kind of way of working. So when you do that, you are able to peel off the multiple realities. And what I've done in my work is privileged the notion of construction rather than naturalization. So children, early childhood is not a natural phase of development. It is a contested space of where, you know, the priorities are driven by the political, social, economic circumstances, and children are inserted within this equation. And in Africa, what we're facing is an underinvestment in this space here. And one of the ways in which we can tap into, for example, the perspective that Dr. Nugiduku is promoting is to readjust the imagery that we use of children in our policy, in our programs, in our practices, and everything related to it. So the image of the becoming child is predominantly the traditional image, the child on the road to adulthood, not yet competent. We're promoting the being view of the child that says wherever the child is in a present state is full of possibilities, so engage with it. And yet another B that is added to this is the sense of belonging. Every child is placed contextually, so their biology has an experience dimension to it. And so the cultural context has to be studied to unpack it. So when you look at very young children, where it's very challenging, this view of the being view, it's very challenging in early childhood. But you look at what the Reggio Emilia approach presents as the hundreds of languages. All right, look at children's exploration. Look at the way in which they are performing. Look at where they are scribbling. Look at where they are playing. Look at who they are engaging with. It's not just the verbal of what they are saying. It's the non-verbal and everything in between that unpacks the layer of the agency perspective that is presented to us. And that being the case, I work a lot in terms of the agentic view of adults and children and context responsiveness. And so this is now the framings of several publications that are coming out this year and next year. The one is around to influence practice. It's curriculum assessment pedagogy that looks at the conceptualization of the thinking teacher, African epistemologies for context responsiveness. The next one looks at situated realities to unpack what professional development would look like in this conceptualization of, for example, the thinking teacher, amongst other conceptualization. And yet another context responsive thing that we're doing is looking at the COVID-19 and looking at young children, their families, and what the global pandemic is doing, has been doing, and will do in the future, because we don't believe that this is just ended here. So in summary, I really want to thank Dr. Nugiduku for allowing us the space for deeper engagement on the agency perspective of children, the marginalization that continues to surround them, and the conditions that shapes particular kinds of childhood. She's part of an emerging and growing scholar community in Africa, and I really want to celebrate her. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ibrahim. You gave us such deep engagement there. We are all now going to read these works that are coming out. We have pearls of wisdom there. I wrote so much, my pen has run out. Thank you so much. You've given us an absolute wealth there of issues to discuss further. It's now my great pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce Dr. Odur Obura. Dr. Obura is currently a lecturer at Zetech University at Nairobi. He holds a PhD from Potsdam University in Germany, and he has published and is a specialist on the culture and literature of Eastern Africa and Anglophone modernities. In brackets, he's also a poet, no less. His book, Decolonizing Childhoods in Eastern Africa, Literary and Cultural Representations, is about to be published by Routledge, I think, next month. So that's super exciting. Dr. Obura, I can't wait to hear what you have to say on these issues. So it's over to you.
Thank you very much for this invitation, Pastor Eliza Nugiduku, Dr. Eliza Nugiduku. I really have enjoyed your presentation because it really fits into some of the kind of epistemic concerns that I have had about the children in Africa, or about the childhoods in Africa. And I'm quite excited by that methodological approach that you've taken to listen and to read childhood. So I'll respond to that in two ways, and I would request that you let me switch off my video for the sake of my internet connection as I do my presentation, if that is okay. Yeah, so first, I will speak on the globalized epistemic and hermeneutical injustice that Dr. Eliza Nugiduku has already mentioned. So for me, the generation of meaning or meanings of African childhood is often defined socially, and not only by adults, but also adults who are not fully tuned into the sensibilities of being a marginalized African, or being a marginalized African child. So these adults can be located within and out of the African continent. So this can happen at the level of a Western researcher, for example, coming into Africa, or an NGO organization moving through the various forms of childhood in Africa. So I think this speaks to quote Eliza, the grand stories that are also connected to the grand stories of money and voices of adults located elsewhere in the North who control power and resources of the voice of the child that makes it to policy. So I've invested a lot of my energies in research about on the relationship between childhood in the global South and childhood childhoods, I prefer the pluralities, childhoods in the global South and childhoods in the global North, not in a binary and competitive way, but to look for pluralities of these childhoods. So I find it interesting how the voice of the child is filtered back to the Western metropolises, and subsequently some of the policies are made and suggested or taken back to be implemented in Africa. So we can say in a way, in a sense, that the hermeneutical injustice is a move towards a singularized sense of childhood. And normally this is projected from the global North, this depiction. And I also work with representation of childhoods in monolithic terms. So the multiple experiences that Dr. Nugiduku has also mentioned in her presentation. So for me, these multiple experiences, histories, and the presences, they are often deleted in this kind of attempt to have a singularized sense of childhoods. So it's not something that happens only at the present, but we can also find that the archive of childhood globally is full of children from the global South without a voice. For example, such as the brutalities made on children in the rubber plantations in colonial Congo. So we can find these silence present and current times. Yet these silences obscure the idea that knowledge is many times communal, particularly in Africa. And ideas, for example, of what it means to be an orphan are many times not legal, and they're not rigorous categories, but usually they are broadly defined in local and various dimensions. So the sense of communities then moves us to consider the pluralities of childhood in Africa. So the definition, for example, of the vulnerability by international NGOs that operate in Africa, but with headquarters in the West, for example, define orphans as children who have lost both biological parents. Yet, if we listen softly the way Dr. Eliza Nugiduku suggests, if we listen softly and for long, then we see that children sometimes do not conceptualize themselves as orphans just by the loss of two biological parents, because there are different communal ways of defining an orphan. So secondly, how I wish to respond to Dr. Eliza Nugiduku's presentation is based on the continued waste of history, and particularly the unacknowledged multitude of childhoods in Africa. So epistemic injustice exemplifies and amplifies a continued malfunction in appreciating the diversity of the African child. After all, today is the Day of the African Child. So even as we move towards Agenda 2040, we need still to reinvigorate further the participation of the communities and children almost on an equal footing. So the top-bottom approach, I think Professor Ibrahim has also mentioned something to that effect. The top-bottom approach does not work. So the national frameworks in the adoption, for example, of the Continental Charter on the rights and the welfare, I underline the welfare because it made a lot of changes in how we conceptualize children vis-a-vis the differences between the North and the South approaches to childhood. So this top-bottom framework needs to listen to these various approaches to childhood. Like I've already mentioned, the case of definition of an orphan. We cannot have rigid legal definitions, but we need to listen to how these children's voices, so that we do not waste the crisis that history has presented to us, but we use these experiences to understand the differences in childhoods. So I reiterate that, and I am in support with what Eliza calls the long-term listening, so that we use this form of long-term listening to benefit from history and to reassess the history of many childhoods, so that we walk away from this tendency to have a monodirectional approach to our understanding of children. So this is important, if only to trace the layers of the voices of African children drowned by history. For example, we could talk about the case of Kalulu. This is a historical child, but who has been largely forgotten in history. So his experience at the hands of colonial processes ought to count for something. We need to learn from some of these histories. And we do that in order to reinscribe agency that Professor Ishima talks of. We use history to reinscribe agency and let these children speak, not only from their graves, but from their zones of material poverty as well. And also, we let the children speak from cultural and intellectual wealth in equal measure. We look at childhood from different dimensions, like Dr. Nugiduku suggests. So we can then listen softly to the interjections of the child in a chronological and in a historical framework, what the child says. And as Eliza has told us, the unsaid, the silences. And if we are looking at history again, then we have to unearth sometimes the buried silences and the unforeseen, what was done but was unforeseen. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see. So we can use the unforeseen history and experiences to avert the epistemicide that has been committed through a designed silencing of the voice of the African child. So thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed Eliza's contribution and presentation.
Thank you so much, Odura Obura. We really enjoyed your presentation, and your use of history there was so insightful and profound, and to bring Kalula, into this total respect. And I'm sure many more people will be buying your book after hearing that wonderful presentation. Thank you. Now, last but by no means least, I'd like to give the Zoom floor, if you like, to our third panelist, Dr. Yisak Tefere, lead qualitative researcher at Young Lives Research Ethiopia, where he has carried out substantial fieldwork, both with Oxford University and Ethiopia University. He holds a PhD in interdisciplinary child research from NTNU, and he has interests in child poverty, well-being, transitions, girl early marriage, child work, social protection, amongst many others. So we are hugely lucky and delighted that he was able to take time from his busy schedule to enjoy us, and we are excited to hear more. So Dr. Yisak, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eliza and other colleagues. I think I found the topic motivating, but at the same time provocative to do more. Can you hear me? Yeah, So I'm really delighted to be participating in this session, which is very important. And we have been trying, I think, to do research with children with young life for the last 14, 15 years in longitudinal research. And I did also my study on childhood. One of the big questions that have been coming to my mind has been, do we really understand children? So if we study, the issue is, do we really understand children, especially children in Africa? In 2017, we had organized an African conference here in Addis Ababa at UN ECA. Probably Eliza has gone through it also for a book, Children First in Africa. So just I shared the link. I co-edited. It has been very important that we still are struggling to contribute from African side to international global childhood study. We are still struggling. So the one thing is the injustice of epistemology. In a sense, the injustice could be a concept that has been drawn against the CRC, Article 12, where children have the right to participate or express their views. There are a lot of articles on that one. But I think there are a lot of constraints for to understand African children. The first thing is, childhood has been coined on the evidence based in the global north. We are very grateful for that, but still we are struggling to transform it into African context so that we don't have that opportunity of contributing the voice of children from Africa, then contribute to the global childhood itself. So just we are adapting and trying to, as much as we can we adapt this theory or the other theory or the methodology. We are still struggling. So that is where we are struggling. The second one is the African context itself, the culture. Children are considered as members of household, not as independent people who can work or decide or have their own voice. That is one challenge that we would like to have to address. The third one is, of course, the researcher ourselves. The first thing is we are oriented west or global north oriented, as we have very limited tools to understand children, very limited resources and patience to have a longitudinal study. In Young Life, we did a longitudinal study for 14, 15 years. We're still learning about the same children because in the first instance, we are just unaware of a lot of their lives because children's knowledge is the lived experience, not what they say, but the lived experience. If you pick up the lived experience, you have to be very patient, to some extent to have to live with them. That's the challenge we have at the moment. So longitudinal research could contribute to that one. Qualitative study, where because in survey you see that the household head can be surveyed, but just counting the children as numbers, their voice is very, very muted. So qualitative research using multiple participatory methods. But in Africa, we have a lot of challenges, so that because our methodology and our childhood conceptualization is not really based from our children. That's the challenge we have. So at the end, the question will be, are children epistemological injustice considered as wrong norms? I would consider we are wrong listeners as researchers and as a public. The wrong thing is in the listeners and in the understanding of them. If we could understand them really, then we could have policies and programs that really matter to them. What we get challenges are, for instance, when we ask children, then what is important for them is very less important for us as adults. And it's very difficult as adults to live as children. Although we have been there in the past, then it's very difficult for us. That is applicable for everybody, but for children, it is very difficult. Perhaps the challenge also, another challenge in Africa is considering the childhood understanding. As you know, historically, childhood has been basically evolving in different steps in the academic. And the main one is playing and learning. Children have been considered playing and learning as basic of their activities. But in Africa, a child could be working, learning, some if privileged, playing, but also marrying, even in generating income. So what is the definition of childhood by itself? Is it the age? Age doesn't matter, I mean, at the moment. It is a lived experience. So it is up to us as researchers to dig deep. And the topic of today, what has brought to my mind is that, is there any opportunity for, from the global north and global south, we try as much as possible understand children's lived experience in Africa, understand them, then contribute their voices to the global childhood. As you know that CRC, some of the articles of CRC are not considered in the African Child Charter for Child because, for instance, work, it is very difficult. So we are less contributing. That less contributing means African children's voice is less considered in the international arena, in policies, in interventions, programs, and other things. And that is rooted also in our culture, in our limitation of understanding or methodology or researchers. So that has to be, addressed. And this is, I think, the discussion is very important for us. And thank you, Eliza, for just bringing an important topic. Thank you very much.
Dr. Isak, thank you so much for your wisdom and insight and profound words there. They're going to be fantastic to move us on to the next part of today's event, which is to hear more from you all as panelists, perhaps with a question for each other. What was it about the presentations that has perhaps struck you as particularly novel? Or my question would be for you all, what kind of pushback have you had in relation to the way that perhaps for some it's controversial that, that childhood should be given such agency, such a platform should be taken so seriously? What kind of pushback do you get? And also listening to ourselves as Africans, that was a very interesting quote from Dr. Nugiduku. And I just wondered also what you have done in relation to your research in that point as African scholars, African experts. So maybe let's start with Dr. Nugiduku. Do you have any comments, questions for your fellow panelists or with regard to what I mentioned there? We may have lost Elizabeth. So in the meantime, would any of our other panelist participants like to comment on what they've heard from each other? Anything?
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Can I jump in?
Please do, Odur.
Okay. I think I want to respond to a concern or a question that you raised about the pushbacks when we are practicing both as scholars and as activists in the field of childhood. I think quite often, I think there's a lot of resistance when we talk about the push for agency within local childhoods in Africa. And I remember conducting an interview with a former NGO PR officer, public relations officer. And I was asking about this persistent portrayal of childhood in Africa in a very predictable way, which is often the child is located in a war-torn zone. the child is living in poverty, the child is disease affected, and all that kind of perception. And they tell me that whenever they try to have a positive depiction of children in their campaigns, that the money does not flow in. So there's a challenge of the grand story versus the grand stories, which try to challenge the grand story of portraying the child in a monodirectional way. So I think for me, this is one of the pushbacks that we get, because there's that claim they cannot get the funding if they change the grand narrative of the disempowered African child. That, I think that's one thing that I've experienced in my research.
Oh, it's fascinating, but also depressing to hear this kind of pushback. Dr. Nugiduku is back with us, and Eliza, I wondered what you've had in your mind in relation to perhaps asking the other of your panelists questions about their research, or began the discussion by talking about the pushback that he's received. I also put out there how you might have listened to your African voice and how that affected your research methodology.
Sorry, hello. You're asking in terms of listening to myself, how that one did affect my methodology. Sorry, Joanna, can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to put off my video. I wanted to know whether you're asking how listening to myself did affect my methodology. I think when I located myself in terms of the many years I've spent also giving voice to children, and the fact that I was asking myself at some point, then what is this voice that we are talking about, that we are giving children, and how can we talk about this voice in a different way? Then that's when, of course, that deep reflexivity also started on the part of me. And for many years, I was also engaging with the issues of maybe these particular representations, which is good, and I've said it's good that we also engage the representations. But then I thought it is important also to look into different ways in which also we can understand these particular representations and also what they do. For example, if I just start from what Odor talks about, looking at the category of the orphan and the vulnerable child, in my research, I've engaged categories and the categorizing practices in Africa, and especially around issues of poverty and vulnerability. But I also ran with that particular category and also placed it in different contexts and tried to understand it. So in such a way, also listening to myself differently also enabled me also to create a space also for useful critique, which also borrows from the others, but also tries to create. And that, I think that is where I am now, in terms of how can we create between different knowledge systems. How can we establish a space for creation where we are able to listen to each other, but also listen to each other in productive ways without anybody being left out and without feeling like we are using some particular knowledge system as a yardstick. I think that is what I would say.
That's wonderful, thank you. And I wanted to turn to the other panelists, perhaps who haven't spoken in this part of the section, to also put any questions or any observations they have about the other presentations in light of what Dr. Nugiduku said there about helping each other, you all working together, moving the debate, the discourse forward. Or perhaps there's something you don't agree on. Perhaps there's an area of difference of opinion, how to move forward. I'm very interested in how, I think Odor is coming back in there.
Yes, I was interested in what Dr. Nugiduku talked about, the use of other factors besides the multiplicity, the plural. It's not just about plural. I think in one of the slides, you mentioned the idea that it's not just about the plural alone. So I would be interested in how in what else you are interested in when we're talking about the agency of the child besides the focus on the plural alone. Because I think for me, I've invested a lot of my research in looking for different ways to read the child, so that we walk away from this hierarchical kind of viewing of children. So I would be interested in listening to other ways that Dr. Eliza Nugiduku's research has also come up with other ways of listening to the child, besides just the plural way alone.
Great question. Thank you. Thank you, Udur.
Yes, I think thank you for your question. And I think we are talking about pluralizing voice. We are talking about the same thing, but talking about different aspects. Because you're talking about looking at childhood, the plural notions of childhood and avoiding the singularity. But what I talked about is the voice itself, in the sense that what we have talked about is a polyvocality, and to say that children's, there are different voices, and this means there are different voices of different children and different contexts, which in itself is very important in that sense. But then in terms of also looking at voice as a multiplicity, I meant that you can also look at these different voices of different children who are located in different contexts, which is very important. But you can also look at the dimensions. And for me, the dimensions is like, for example, you can research silence itself as form of agency and a form of voice. But then you can also understand other aspects of voice also by looking at what is absent in what is already said. So that is a dimension. It is not a plural aspect of voice, but it's another dimension of voice. And so sometimes when you leave it out, then you can still pluralize by relying on what is spoken. But you can also talk about plural childhoods also by also locating yourself within these particular different methods that you've also used to understand that particular experience or plurality of childhoods. So I'm looking at, and if I just want to give an example of what I did, for example, in terms of relying on the voice, I went in one of the exercises, I asked one young man, where is your father? And he told me, my father is not there. And in that particular context, when somebody tells you my father is not there, it means the father is dead. And I wrote in my notebook that the father is dead. But then after some few interactions, I discovered that his father was alive. And the grandmother told me his father is alive. I did not go back to ask him, but I looked at his essays where he had written about how his father did abandon him when the mother was young. So I did understand that, that aspect of saying my father is not there is not just lies, it's not just voices and truth. It is voice that is also telling us about a reality of a particular child. And then as I continued, then I also had caregivers telling me that our children are orphaned. But then after some time, I discovered that they're not orphaned. When I was doing the other type of deconstruction, I would say that these caregivers have been conditioned by programs to cheat or to lie this way. But then I discovered there are fathers in this particular community who are called alive but dead. Don't care for their children. And so it is a coping strategy for children just to say that my father is not there. And when I went to groups of women and found them caregivers in groups of widow caregivers. And they told me, yeah, we have a husband, but he's dead. This group is my husband. So if you look at it from only what they tell you, then you might say, yeah, they are not speaking the truth. But then forget that there are these different aspects that you can know by doing research differently. So I'm looking at a slightly different dimension in terms of the unit of voice, but not the number.
Thank you, Eliza, for that. I'm wondering if Professor Ibrahim wants to come in at this point. I was absolutely in awe of the way that you work on very young children, 0 to 5 years. And I wondered if you wanted to say more about that, or to contribute to any of the conversations that have been started here about approaches to everybody's research.
Thank you very much, and I hope that I'm not cut off. I think that the important thing, and I see this is coming up in the chat as well, is the categorical thinking that we subject ourselves into. So when we look at children, for example, we're not looking at the category of difference as promoted by gender, for example. So it's looking at boys and girls, and then we racialize their identities and we get a different reading. So at each stage, the categories of difference give us different types of reading. And it's very interesting that we spoke about the African child. So the African child stands for a universalized category of where the contents are mostly drawn from unfamiliar territory, adapted in order to fit into our context. And I remember when I did the study on constructions of early childhood, the child was something that I unpacked in terms of its deficit views and deficit framings when you add categories of differences to it. For example, socioeconomic conditions, gender, race, class, religion, all sorts of lines of differences that are seen as fault lines for correction. So I think it's very important to recognize the realities of children and families for what they are and where they are located. And I think Dr. Nugiduku and others have already pointed the direction that we have to adjust our lenses, and coining the concept of listening softly is possibly a direction methodologically that gives us different kinds of readings. So we need to be brave to do border crossing, to disable the kinds of dominance that has given us particular ways of thinking, feeling, acting, and being, because it's not working out for us. Why do we do it? We do it, like somebody mentioned, to work in the funder's gaze. So a lot of the work, for example, in early childhood is driven by funding houses that have particular kinds of priorities. And these priorities come with particular kinds of conceptualizations of childhood and families. And for example, curriculum and the curriculum experiences. So when projects fail, we don't question the conceptualization, but we see the fault in the people that are actually rolling out these programs. So I think we really need to unpack this critically, where we find that we're using some things that is not working out for us. The other problem that I have also is that when you get ready-made answers, it takes away the agency to ask the critical question. What does that mean? It means that you settle too quickly and you carry on with the work that needs to be done. So what Dr. Nugiduku's work does is it tells you to stop a little bit, to pause, and the pause is where the critical kind of thinking happens to say, this is what I'm faced with, and what do we do now? So in summary, I think that there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done from a generational perspective, right from early childhood. And we are working now from conception onwards, and looking at the motherhood and the first 1,000 days and things like that. But we also have to tease and unpack the nuances that shape our particular kinds of action. So lots and lots of work to be done in terms of thinking new, thinking differently, and thinking afresh so that we can have different outcomes. Thank you.
Professor Ibrahim, thank you so much for that. What a rallying cry. And let's hope as many policymakers and funders will get to listen to this very rich podcast. And we're getting so many compliments and thank yous in the chat from people who have attended, and we've got a couple of questions coming through. This is the next part of the session then, where we open it up to the audience. And if you put your questions through the Q&A, that would be fantastic. So Charity de Rotzi, thank you very much for joining us and your question. She has a specific question, first of all, for Dr. Nugiduku. How are you able to engage and get the perspective of the youngest child, the very youngest ones, in your very interesting research?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think if I use the example of the child that we saw in that particular photo, I was of course visiting mostly in the evenings, of course, and most of it was also observing. This child is also, the mother died a year before my research, and so also suffering from HIV/AIDS, and also the younger sister, and living with their caregiver. So most of what I was doing is also to visit. But then I also gave the camera to the older brother also to be able to represent the experience of their sister and just take the photos. And for example, I was able to get photos of that child, different moments. At one point, she was holding like an empty flask. And I asked the brother what was happening, why was she crying? And he said he was crying because there was no more porridge for her. And then I asked, are there days when there's no porridge? And then he told me there are days that there's no porridge. But of course, my observations in terms of this child was also malnourished, also had, kwashiorkor, and also like the observing also the hair. But then even through the photo, sometimes that the brother even did not think about, when that child is looking behind, I asked, what is she doing there? And then I also got to learn that most of the time, this particular child is left there alone, up to maybe 2 hours alone by the foster mother when she goes to work. So observations also, but these photos that also acted also as entry points, but also interacting with the child from time to time when I visited them.
Thank you so much for that answer. I'm sure that has done a lot to answer that question, and the research techniques are so creative, amazing. We've got a question from Emile von den Brink to all panelists. She is asking you, is there really such a thing as the African child, with the in bold there? She adds that every child is uniquely different. So is a holistic approach to research and understanding African children's voices not needed? Instead of continuing to lump all these uniquenesses as one and calling it the African child or the African child's voice? So that's for you all. Is there such a thing as the African child?
I think I would start, and thank you for that observation. I think also talking about uniqueness, it's already presupposes that we cannot talk about a unified voice of the child, but locate myself in terms of, as an activist, of course, sometimes we also have to take entry points, and part of the activism also we'll be doing is also to engaging with the global knowledge, because they also have this singular notion of an African child. And I think what my colleague Odwor is talking about is also how do you also pluralize these particular childhoods. So I usually sometimes call myself a feminist killjoy for children. And when I go for these forums, I have also to speak from a particular perspective and engage that dominant. Tell them sometimes we are tired of being misrepresented as children of Africa. So I do agree that there's actually no African childhoods. But then we also have to locate this child also in context, and also within the context of a day-to-day also, when we're also talking about how these voices are also represented in policies and programs, there's almost an observation that because of these representations, because of these erasures of our knowledge, because of the universal knowledge being used as a yardstick for measuring our own ways of knowing, then there's sometimes a need to coalesce around a misrepresented African child, and then be able to see how we can recreate these particular images. But of course, the voice that we are seeking here enables us also to see these nuances and these differences and idiosyncrasies of childhood in different contexts. And by listening differently and long term, then of course you are able to know what is it that is at stake for these particular children, and then revisit your gaze.
Thank you so much. Any other of our panelists like to respond to that?
Yeah, can I come in?
Dr. Yisak, please do.
Yes, I think an interesting question, and it's also a challenge. But I think childhood has two components: one as a concept or a form, and the second one is as a real. So as a concept, as Controp has described it, as a form, there is a conceptualization of childhood that we can agree or as a starting point, whether it is the West or Africa or Asia or anything, combined by maybe explained by age and some of the major common activities, for instance, education, learning or playing and other activities. So as a concept or as a form, it is, I mean, you can consider it as global or uniform. But also another component is as real life. So a real life makes it where you live. As African, as I said, lived experience is very important for childhood. So as a lived experience, African children have lived in a certain context, could be poverty or education, work, early marriage, and other experience that makes them as different to the other children, for instance, from the global south. So it's as a form and reality.
Thank you so much for that. It's like a hot knife through butter. Any of our other panelists want to respond to that question? If not, I will. Oh yes, please, Odur.
Thank you. And I think the question of what is an African child hits right at the center of childhood as a discipline of academic study. So I think this raises a very, very important point on how we conceive of the discipline. And I think many other questions, for example, have been asked on the definition of what a child is. If I put aside the idea of an African child, then what exactly is a child? Do we use legal parameters to define a child as this kind of monolithic idea that a child has to be above 18, or above 16, and beyond that, when we're talking of adults? And do we talk of a 1-week baby as a child? Where do we draw the boundaries of a child? So I think I like the idea that Dr. Nugiduku speaks of the need for an entry point. And I'm also aware that there's this tendency in postmodernist kind of thinking to almost obliterate differences to nothing. So it's a matter of, I am unique, she's unique, so she's white, I'm black, you know, all these kind of intersection, these different categories. But I think at some point we also need to be strategic so that we find an entry point, right? An entry point in which we are led by the existence of certain patterns. And in the portrayal of a child, for example, I mentioned the idea of always when we see a child, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, you know, portrayed in terms of living in war zones and all these kind of disenfranchising imagery. So I think these sort of patterns draw us to kind of attempt to describe the discipline of childhood. So I think for me, this is how I would look at the entire debate on the definition of what an African child is.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I've got 2 questions I want to join together, but Professor Ibrahim, would you like to come in here first? I don't want to cut you off.
Yes, I just wanted to say that the whole concept of the African child, one of the ways in which we can approach it is to say, well, like Dr. Nugiduku has said, it's an entry point, but it's an entry point under erasure. So meaning that it could have in its print, you can see it in very dark print, and on a continuum, you can see it getting lighter. Now, when I worked in early childhood, one of the issues that really helped me to make sense of what was going on was to look at the concept of age. So instead of looking at chronological age, I began looking at social age. So I just wanted to make the point that keep the dominant concept under erasure.
Thank you for that. We needed to hear that. And I just want to then sneak in perhaps 2 last questions, but also there is a comment from Amelia Vandenbrink on this question, encouraging us to stress the context of children. So this is an issue that can be discussed outside of this, I'm sure. And I'm going to put 2 questions together because they're on the same theme, and these will have to be the last, I'm afraid. One is from Dr. Elizabeth Kituka from Kenya. So hello there. And it's to all panelists. So she is asking, what about the factors contributing to many of the African children with regard to grandparents and cultural or religious ideologies or stereotypes? Do you look at those? And taking that further, Obala Musumba has asked the question, what is your opinion? Is it an epistemic injustice to have institutions that, in his words, indoctrinate the child with regard to religion in the guise of nourishing them spiritually? So what is your view, I suppose? Do you investigate the child, parent and grandparent context more holistically? And what is your view of institutional cultural sites in Africa that Musumba says put the child at the center of their quest to impart various kinds of knowledge to the child?
Yes, looking at issues of what Elizabeth has raised in terms of looking at also the situation of the grandparents, I would say looking at what I did for my research is I also looked at lived experience of children with poverty and vulnerability and locating that particular child at home and at school and also programs of support. So looking at the category of the foster child, but also looking at most of the people who are fostering this particular child while these elderly caregivers. So I looked at some of the vulnerabilities that they do face, but then those vulnerabilities also impact on the well-being of their children. And so so I looked at it from that perspective and also locating a child in a context. For example, my context was a context of HIV/AIDS, where most of the caregivers have died leaving their children with grandparents, and looking at some of the challenges that these grandparents also do face. And so coming also to the issue of culture and also issues of religion also, I think I'll give an example for this particular research where we've also done a lot of solidarity around culture. How do we leverage knowledge, local knowledge and culture in terms of care for children? And of course, the starting point has been that, our cultural practices are also grotesque, they are gothic, they also, they are mistreating the children and all that, they are against children and children's rights. So we went and talked about what are some of the issues that are positive in this particular culture that enable you to take care of your children. And we found that there are proverbs, we found that there are stories, we found that there are different ways of knowing and also reciprocity that is very positive for children. And so by looking at that particular entry point of the positive issues in that particular culture, then we are able also to engage on the basis of some things that we thought were not in line with what young people needed. For example, we asked, when you say that your girls are less important than boys, then we went to that particular culture and found there's a proverb that says, every child is deserving of their place seat. So we engaged on from the basis of a place seat, and then came to understand with the communities that even these girls also deserve their place seat. So I think that would be a good starting point also, looking at also religion, because there are also some positive aspects of religion also. Of course, there would be other issues of also radicalization that would be maybe outside the particular limit of what would be called a nurturing cultural practice that enables children to thrive. So you can start from appreciating what is there, and then the communities themselves will also look into how can we be able to do it differently instead of coming to condemn wholesale.
If anybody would like to respond to that, I think we unfortunately run out of time. So what I would like to do is to hand over to Dr. Nugiduku to make some concluding remarks.
Wow. Thank you so much for the healthy debate that has taken place in the last 90 minutes, of course. And thank you, Joanna, also for the way you've also led us so well. And I've also written, I think, more than you do. And I'm also looking forward to see what has also come out of these particular discussions. And I think for me, it is also to learn from everybody else, not only from the panelists, but also from others who gave their perspectives all the way from South Africa, also from Kenya and from Uganda. I've learned a lot in terms of also listening to Dr. Ibrahim and talking about how we can also readjust our imagery of children. And so I'm also learning that, the starting point must also be how do you see child before you can even be able to understand their voice. And also listening to Odror and talking about also looking at the archives also, because these misrepresentations are also historical, and how you can also engage with that in terms of also trying also to look at this particular waste, but also you can also engage and listen long-term in terms of also listening to history if we have also to look into these issues. And I think also from Yitzhak, I think I got, in addition to the very good comments he's made today and also what I've learned, is that we should also now start talking about lived experience also, instead of just talking about voice, because the lived experience itself can be a form of voice. So I think for me, when talking about listening softly, it's also listening in the sense that I'm also listening to what Azina has talked about, the 100 languages, and sometimes we steal the 99 and we only leave the child with one, but also looking at this multiplicity of issues that are tangled within a child's lived experience that determine their voice, but they also determine the way we also listen to them. And I think that would be the challenge for us, just to ask ourselves and to be reflexive every minute and every yard of the way. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Ikenna, and also the organizers also for making this a success.